Sectarian violence in Myanmar has forced thousands of displaced Rohingya Muslim refugees to leave their homeland and come to Jammu region of Indian-controlled Kashmir. The refugees mostly fled the Buddhist majority state of Rakhein after authorities failed to stop attacks by extremist Buddhists. Security forces in Myanmar were at some point accused of involvement in the attacks. The Rohingya refugees in Indian-controlled Kashmir are now living in makeshift tents on government land and fear possible evacuation. India is not a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees. There is therefore no law that deals with foreign refugees, and the government decides whether or not to grant the Rohingya refugees status on a case-by-case basis.
The world body has relief and rehabilitation for all displaced communities except for the Rohingya Muslims. We have been living here for the past years, but not even once has anyone bothered to pay attention to our conditions. I think death is better than a miserable life.
And as the fasting month of Ramadan has started in hot summer, the Muslim community is dealing with tougher challenges.
There are not many jobs for us, nor are we paid equal to citizens. The unfortunate fact is that during this holy month, we have less to eat and we can do nothing about it except for praying.
It's not just unemployment, the refugees are denied access to health care and education even in India. According to United Nations, Rohingyas are one of the world's most persecuted minorities. They've long been grappling with similar problems, yet international humanitarian organizations have not done much for them, and their conditions are deteriorating. Shahana Bhatt reporting for Press TV in the Jammu region of Indian-controlled Kashmir.
Our fourth story now. No end to the plight of Muslims in Myanmar. The Muslim community in the country's second largest city accuses police of inaction on Buddhist extremism. Witnesses say scores of police officers just stood by as a Buddhist mob burned a school and other buildings near the city of Mandalay. They say some of the rioters were armed with sticks, metal pipes and even saws. The violence followed the funeral of a Buddhist man who was killed in sectarian clashes. Extremist Buddhists have killed hundreds of Muslims and forced many more to flee the country. The Myanmar government has been repeatedly criticized by human rights groups for failing to protect the country's Rohingya Muslims. The UN says the Rohingyas are one of the most persecuted minorities across the world. Let's discuss this more and go to Atlanta and talk to James Jennings, President of Conscience International. Welcome, sir. Mr. Jennings, first of all, why is it that it seems there's complete ignorance towards the situation of the Rohingya Muslims?
It's not a very big issue on the Western view of things because so many other issues and problems in the world. However, in terms of being a long-term and very dangerous issue, this is a major one. In the Asian context. And this is a new development for most of the repression has happened in Rakhine state, where most of the Rohingya Muslims are located. But this is over on the eastern side, and in Mandalay, it's a whole different situation. It seems that in the last 2 years, the Buddhist majority has been radicalized and become more and more racist in their attacks upon the Muslims, especially the Rohingya.
And what is it with the Buddhist extremists? I mean, are they legally untouchable?
Yes, in a way they are, because the military junta that ruled was not officially connected with the Buddhist religion, but ethnically and in terms of history they were. And so they have been favorable to that group. But the other thing is that the increasing nationalism of the Buddhists, they don't just have the Rohingya Muslims to oppose, but they have the Karens in the south, who are mostly Christians, the Chin in the north, and these conflicts have been going on for a long time now. But the last 2 years has been very dangerous indeed, and for this situation to be inflamed in Mandalay now, I think signals an escalation or a new step in the conflict. And we have to be worried about that because, in fact, in Asia and in Myanmar, this military government has been very repressive over a period of almost 50 years. And then in 1990, the opposition voted 85% to oust them, but they stayed in power. However, they have put Aung San Suu Kyi, a very popular leader, into the government, and yet they still have some control. So it's a gradual process that has not been resolved satisfactorily. And I think that the Buddhist parties are making an issue out of this for political purposes, as well as a very strong anti-ethnic racism against the Muslims, because they feel that they're coming in from Bangladesh and elsewhere and have no right there. However, the truth is they've been there for 1,000 years, many of them.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Many thanks to James Jennings, President of Conscience International from Atlanta. Thanks for your time there, sir.
Meanwhile, Sri Lanka is under fire by critics for turning a blind eye to rising anti-Muslim violence in the island nation. Well, the criticism follows last month's deadly attacks by the hardline Bodu Bala Sena group, or the Buddhist Power Force, on 3 mostly Muslim towns. At least 2 Muslims were killed and dozens of others injured in the worst violence against them in decades. The Buddhist mobs also stole piles of cash and jewelry from Muslim families there. Now, Sri Lankan media, moderate Buddhists, and even the Justice Minister have slammed President Mahinda Rajapaksa's government for what they call its apparent reluctance to protect Muslims. Foreign embassies and the United Nations have also demanded action. Crossing over to London, joined by Islamic Human Rights Commission Representative Arzu Mirali. Good to have you with us. Tell us about this situation. Now, there has been some pressure, or there is at least some criticism about the deadly attacks that took place last week. Do you see it making a difference in the tactics of the Sri Lankan government or not?
Well, it remains to be seen. You can hold out some hope. It's good that it's at least being flagged up in international circles, but more importantly, internally, because I think one of the problems that has been happening over a number of years is the internal discourse in Sri Lanka, which on the one hand has allowed the rise of kind of hate speech against Muslims and other minorities to kind of rise unabated, which has ultimately resulted in violence. And yet they're not being in sort of equal momentum, which is against that. So the internal criticism is very welcome, but it needs to continue, and it does need external support. And that's where there's been a lack for many, many years.
With the situation now, we see actually that there has been some type of solidarity with some of the more moderate Buddhist group, along with other entities of the society, with Muslims trying to put pressure on this issue. Is that, it appears to be a note, an optimistic note in itself. Do you think that with the coming together of perhaps more coalitions like this from various perspectives, that it could actually put the pressure on the government that's needed to bring about changes in the country?
In the short term, I think probably not, and that's why I'm emphasizing that, whilst it's a welcome move and, as you said, a glimmer of optimism, it needs to really carry on and work through for the medium and the long term. To put it in context, we had these deadly incidents, these attacks on Muslims in the last month in a kind of southern areas of Sri Lanka. But, attacks on Muslim businesses have been going on for an awful long time in Sri Lanka. And beyond that, we also have the issue of massive amounts of internally displaced persons who are Muslim in heritage or are actually Muslim in the north of the country. We're talking for over 20 years now, and that's in over 100,000 people. So there's a whole kind of crisis with regard to how minorities, Muslims in particular, kind of have a place and role in society in Sri Lanka. So that kind of criticism that's coming up in the wake of the recent attacks needs to really kind of develop into a systemic critique of what is going wrong within the structures of essentially Sinhalese institutions in Sri Lanka, and generally in the way minorities are treated.
Thank you so much for being with us out of London from the Islamic Human Rights Commission, Ms. Arzu Mirali. Well, the Dalai Lama has urged Buddhists in Myanmar and Sri Lanka to stop violence against Muslims. In a speech to mark his 79th birthday in northern India, the Dalai Lama described the violence in both Buddhist majority countries targeting religious minority Muslims as unacceptable. He also urged Buddhists in Myanmar and Sri Lanka to imagine an image of Buddha before committing crimes against Muslims. Sri Lanka is under fire by critics for turning a blind eye to rising anti-Muslim violence on the island nation. Hundreds of Muslims have also been killed in Myanmar in clashes with Buddhist mobs over the past 2 years.